This week on The Right Side, we have a special year-end episode where we cover all the best, worst, and most interesting stories of the year, plus more, featuring NAFTA trade talks, the ascension of Jason Kenney, the wacky timeline of the BC elections, and Trudeau's struggles with a kayak. This is The Right Side, episode 49, the 2017 Right Side Review. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this last episode of The Right Side in 2017. Good to be back with you guys all. Hopefully you guys are having a great Christmas holiday, Christmas break. Welcome back.
It's good to be back for our last episode of the year, and we've got a real special one here for you folks.
Indeed it is, and, you know, normally when we wrap these shows up, we could do a clip show, we could highlight various things that might have been funny, that might have happened behind the scenes, but we do try and take ourselves a little bit seriously here at The Right Side. And what we are going to do instead is we're going to do a year in review episode where we talk about all of the stories that we covered this year in a multitude of categories. So many categories we got this year. And, you know, it really was quite a year looking back at what we have here, just, you know, going through our huge list of items and thinking, does this deserve to be mentioned again at the end of the year? And, you know, just a little bit of a side note here for those of you guys wondering how we produce The Right Side. Over the span of this entire year, we have looked at least 350 or more news items for consideration of putting on the podcast this year. So each episode we reduce it down to 3 or 4, and that's a lot when you consider that we had 350 plus for the entire year. So we're going to break them up into categories, and our first category is something that we're going to get out of the way here because it's a rarity. And it's the reason we exist, and that is the best covered story by the mainstream media here in Canada. So this is the story that the media covered the best.
That's right, and you can consider this episode as kind of like the Oscars for the Canadian news, and how all of these topics, we've basically deliberated over them, and we've basically given our winners to each of these categories here. So you can either consider it the Oscars or the raspberries, I suppose, of the Canadian news.
That's actually a pretty good way of thinking about it.
Exactly. So what did you have for our best covered story by the mainstream media, Shane?
All right. Well, you'll know that the finance minister has been in trouble a lot this year, whether it be relating to the tax issues and the higher taxes he brought in when he first became finance minister, or the ethical issues around him and not placing his assets in a blind trust. And the media has actually done a pretty good job at following all the issues with Bill Morneau this year and highlighting exactly what might have happened and what the implications of these things were, to the point where the media has actually said that, you know, if these allegations are proven true, this would be insider trading. And you have to remember, in the Westminster style of democracy, which we use here in Canada in our parliament, the finance minister is a very senior minister to the prime minister. And whenever a finance minister is under investigation, that says a lot about what's actually happening. And the media had to cover this. And if they didn't, they would be grossly negligent in not doing it.
Mm-hmm. Right, and it was not something that just happened over 1 week either. This was something that was covered over multiple months, and more kept getting found out about it after the initial blind trust story. The news that he was regulating and passing bills relating to pension companies, of which he still held shares in his company, Morneau Chappelle. And that was quite a big story, and that was being talked about a lot in the House of Commons as well. So I know that was being covered quite a bit in the news media, and I think that's something that we should give them props for, because it was one of the topics that they were able to cover fully.
Definitely. What was the top story for you this year that was covered well?
So this story was actually a very recent one for the right side. This was the ongoing troubles with Kent Hare, and how the title was "Everyone Has a Sob Story," and this is where the thalidomide survivors were coming out to the media and saying that they were belittled by Kent Hare when he was either the disabilities minister or the minister of veteran affairs, and it's very interesting how both of our topics kind of relate to each other in a way, and how they're the media fully covering issues that belong to one of Trudeau's cabinet ministers. And it's interesting how that's something that they decide to cover really fully. And that's something that we've seen a lot, is that when there's a problem with government, the media tends to like to zero in on it and try to cover it. But then a lot of other things, if there isn't a person involved with that they can pin the blame on, so to speak, it's something that doesn't get covered as much.
Yeah, and that also goes into, I think, the who of it, because, we're talking about Kent Hare in this case, and the finance minister in the previous case, but in other cases they might be talking about the prime minister himself. I think there's a higher bar that the media sets for talking about the prime minister, for example, or the premier, whereas they can talk about the disabilities minister or the finance minister with relative ease. So I was thinking that perhaps that might have had a role in why exactly we're seeing this coverage of these two stories here kind of take the reins as our top best this year. So.
Mm-hmm.
Our next topic is the complete opposite of this. What did the media do the worst job in covering? And you might think that we would have a lot of these to decide upon, and yes, we did. We had a lot of these stories, so much so that it was hard picking between this category and some of our other categories down the road as to which might be the absolute worst here. But we're going to start off here with my worst story, and that goes back all the way to episode 3, where there was a refugee charged with multiple sexual assaults at the West Edmonton Mall water park. And the big story behind this, and the story that the media didn't really want to cover, and it took a number of days for this to actually be revealed until there was an interview done with the Edmonton Police Service, was that one of the guy involved was actually a refugee, and that was constantly ducked around for this entire story here. And I think, it's one thing to talk about a sexual assault. That's bad, definitely. But it's another thing when it involves a refugee, and that is avoided in particular by the media. And, I don't know why they would do this, because when you're looking for a story, you need to get all of the facts together. And even if those facts point you in a direction you don't like, you need to talk about that. And that should have been something that should have been asked immediately about the person who carried out this attack. And that should have been also one of the major angles of the story. And it wasn't for a number of days. So major negligence right there on that front.
Yeah, that's right. And especially because it wasn't just a one-off thing. This was a thing that occurred multiple times, and not just not just one time period. It happened over a bunch of times, and it was something that was really serious because it was happening to underage girls as well.
Right.
And it wasn't adult women that he was going after. So it was something, I think, even more serious, and that was something that the media didn't really play up very much, and they didn't really follow through on a lot of their investigation on the story as well. And I think that was another thing that leads it to be the worst covered story by the mainstream media as well.
And you have to consider that West Edmonton Mall is the largest shopping mall in Canada, and so many people go there as tourists. And the water park is a fairly popular attraction in the winter months when we were recording episode 3, and it's also a public area that anyone can just go in there, and that's a major public safety concern when you're thinking about a public area where these kinds of things are happening, but we're not talking about it, and we're not getting all the details on the story. So that was rather unfortunate that we weren't able to get all the details with that. So, all right, what do you got for being pretty bad this year?
So the worst covered story I chose this year would have been back on episode 19, where I talked about what I called the hit job on Andrew Scheer. So what this was multitudes of media establishments, whether it was from the Huffington Post to the CBC to the Globe and Mail to the National Post to many other different outlets, and they were all talking about Andrew Scheer. Now we've come to know Andrew Scheer little bit better over the past year since he's become the leader of the Conservative Party. But at the time when he was first elected, not very many people knew about him or who he was or what he stood for. And I think that's something that the media outlets picked up on. And rather than the Conservative Party being able to drive the narrative, the 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 media decided to go their own way on it, and they all wrote about their own opinions on it. And there was a lot of unspecified news that was coming out about him. And if you were reading it and you didn't really know that much about Scheer, it kind of made him out to be some sort of boogeyman or further to the right person who you wouldn't want to vote for, because a lot of them painted him as, just Harper 2.0 or Harper with a smile. I've heard that a lot, or that he's basically a safe pair of hands in which he doesn't try to do anything wrong, but he doesn't really wow you with anything, or they were talking about how he would reopen debate on a lot of issues that are basically a done deal already in Canada, and they talked about how he was uncharismatic, how he smirked a lot in his articles or in his interviews, no matter what he was talking about. And it's very interesting how a lot of the people they were comparing him to, they compared him to Joe Clark, who of course couldn't form government for very long. and there was another one that they mentioned that he wouldn't talk about certain topics, and that they thought that his religious beliefs would define his policies. And I think that was just all of this all together. It was just really odd to see after we got the first look at a party leader right after he got elected. We didn't see that with Trudeau. We sure didn't see that with Jagmeet Singh when he was elected.
Oh, no, quite the opposite, actually.
Exactly, and we didn't see that with. We even didn't see that with Jason Kenney when he was elected leader in Alberta, and I think that's something that was very strange to see out of the media, and that's why I call that the worst story of the year.
Yeah, it was very strange, and we ended up titling that episode "The Sheer Smear." And, since that point, I think there have been articles that have come out that are attempting to actually paint Andrew Scheer in a more positive light. And the question, just pointing this as one of the worst stories that we covered this year, is why didn't the media put that effort back in the summer and the spring of creating those articles that they're creating now? It's a little bit weird.
It is a little bit weird, and they're talking about him as, being a family man, and how he's, a very easygoing, personable guy, and that a lot of people are getting to know him and they like him, and that he's really likable. And that's something, all of the articles that were comparing him to Stephen Harper, I think they're finding that Andrew Scheer is quite a bit different than Stephen Harper in the way he approaches people, because Stephen Harper, he was a pretty funny guy, but he had a very kind of bookish personality, you could say. He was kind of very upright about how he does things. And I think Scheer, on the other hand, is quite a bit different. He's a little more relaxed, quite a little bit younger than Harper was, of course. And it's a new face. And I think a lot of people were trying to paint him to be something that he wasn't.
Yeah, definitely. And
I think that was something that was really not covered well in the media about him.
That's right. And that takes us nicely into our next set of stories, which is the most important story. So if we were to split out all the episodes of The Right Side this year, what would be the most important story that we talked about in this year? And for me, that goes back to episode 40 with the renegotiation of NAFTA. Let's face it, the U.S. is our largest trading partner. NAFTA is very important to Canada. Free trade with the U.S. is very important Canada. It makes sense to have a free trade deal with the United States because we share so many of, we have the longest border. We also share so many of the same manufacturing techniques, the same companies and whatnot. Goods cross the border so often. It makes sense to have a free trade deal with the United States. And that's why episode 40 with the renegotiation of NAFTA and discovering that this government in Canada, Canada's federal government, isn't exactly on point when it comes to renegotiating NAFTA, to the point of pushing the progressive trade agenda, to the point of stepping out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership ratification and signing agreements to use that as some kind of weird negotiating chip for NAFTA, to attempting to get ahead of NAFTA by looking to open free trade talks with China. And NAFTA not only comes into play in terms of the wider benefits, not only with the economy and our free trade deals, but also with the interactions between the corporations in Canada and the U.S. Softwood lumber and supply management, which we've all talked about before. Those are precursors to the current dispute that's going on between Bombardier and Boeing. And all of this comes back to our stance on NAFTA and our renegotiation of NAFTA and ensuring that we're going to attempt to get a very good deal with NAFTA, but because of what we want to get out of NAFTA isn't exactly on the same page as the U.S., and we're really pushing those negotiations in a different direction, that's having so many negative side effects outside of the economy, including the free trade deals that I mentioned and the economic relationship with the U.S. on softwood lumber, supply management of dairy products, and the airplanes between Boeing and Bombardier. So the renegotiation of NAFTA, I think, is one of the most important things we could have talked about this year.
Yeah, especially so because it drives our economy, our trade with the U.S. that is, and it is something that is so important to Canadian life that even though a lot of people don't know much about our trading history with the United States or how much money actually goes into it, we know that everyone's lives would be different without having the U.S. and without having the U.S. as a favorable trading partner. And so that's, as we've said before, it's basically up to Trudeau and his government to secure the best that we can get out of NAFTA for Canadians, because it is their job to go to bat for us and to make sure that they represent us fairly in these trade negotiations.
And that's what the media is missing. And in particular, the magnitude of how important this is in their coverage.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Now, also on the economic front, that's where your most important story of the year touches on.
Yeah, that's right. And I picked the one from episode 12 when the Northern Gateway pipeline got canceled. But we could also add to that the Energy East pipeline to Quebec getting canceled as well. And a lot of the other energy projects that happened in not just BC, but in all of Canada this year, and how quite a few of them got canceled or they got delayed and being put under review for quite a bit. And a lot of that came down to not just the federal government saying that they want to go ahead with these energy projects, but not actually fully supporting them, but also it comes down a lot, I think, to the different governments that we have across Canada as well, in whether it's the NDP governments in BC or Alberta, but also the Liberal governments in Ontario and Quebec. They also have a lot to deal with this as well. And I think that in this case, a lot of the resource extraction and a lot of the natural resource management that could happen in Canada doesn't actually happen due to all of these the regulation and bureaucracy that happens. And I think that's something that could drive the economy quite a bit more and create a lot more jobs for people. But because of governmental red tape and because of politics, a lot of it isn't happening. And that's why I call that the most important story of the year.
Have to completely agree with that, because it also touches on the front of energy independence and making Canada as a whole, and not only just the provinces in Canada, energy independent. And if we can get some of that energy flowing across the country, that would do wonders for everyone, not just the people in Alberta, as the media seem to like it to be that way. So.
Indeed.
All right, now we're going to talk a little bit about Alberta here, and we're both going to choose an Alberta story for this. Let's just say it's been a very interesting year in Alberta so far, covering this. So, the Alberta story of the year that I have to go with isn't necessarily confined to one episode of The Right Side. It's mainly one person, and that person is Jason Kenney. Because at the beginning of the year, it wasn't even known if Jason Kenney would win the Progressive Conservative leadership race, or even if the Progressive Conservative Party would let him be on the ballot because of how the party's election process worked internally. Following that, there was all the questions being raised about if the unity vote would be successful on both the PC and Wild Rose front. The PCs had to get 50% of the vote. The Wild Rose had to get 75%. Both parties each approved that unity vote with 95% of the vote. And then going forward to that is the election of the United Conservative Party leader, and that was mainly a race between Jason Kenney and Brian Jean, which Jason Kenney won. And ever since he won that leadership race, there has been a constant aura of defense from the government in Edmonton here, from the NDP in particular. So it makes sense to call, in general, Jason Kenney as the central figure of Alberta news this year, in my view, just because pretty much everything from the very beginning of the year through the leadership race to the unity agreement and then the actual leadership election of that party and then the aftermath of that with the NDP has really set the tone for politics this year in Alberta.
That's right, and that's something that I considered part of my Alberta story of the year as well. It was kind of basically the aftermath of what we could call Hurricane Jason Kenney as he swept through the province and basically collected all of the people who were disaffected from the NDP government. And so mine came from episode 36, and it was where Alberta Premier Rachel Notley says that United Conservatives are determined to bring harm to gay children. And that's a pretty out there headline, of course. And that was basically the NDP strategy from that point on after Jason Kenney won the race and was becoming more and more known to media and to people on the street as well. And that was the NDP trying to change the narrative from economic issues and how the Alberta economy was going and how jobs were being created. They're wanting to switch it over to social issues, and that was something that they felt that they could win on. And it actually turned out that Jason Kenney and the UCP decided to flip it back on them and say, well, you've been in government for over 2 years now. What's going on? And why hasn't this been done if you wanted to do it? And I think that it actually weakened the NDP position in Alberta quite a bit just because of that.
I think that's also the episode where we coined the term pretzel twisting.
Yeah, indeed it was, I think. And that's something that we noticed throughout the year in Alberta was how Jason Kenney getting elected kind of changed the narrative of what was happening in Alberta. And how the government has responded to different things is really telling about how they feel what they're going to do in 2018.
And it all comes back to the final example in that case of the Calgary Lougheed by-election last week, where he took 72% of the vote and the NDP came in second with 16%.
Indeed.
All right, so we're going to step one province over and move into BC now, and I'm going back to episode 15 in this case, and the manufactured outrage of hashtag I am Linda. So the I am Linda outrage started off with, a conversation between, I forget her last name, but a woman named Linda and the then premier at the time, Christy Clark, that, went off the rails, so to speak, and was just seized upon by the mainstream media. And, this was talked about extensively. I mean, how long was it talked about? It felt like it was around 10 days probably.
Yeah, it was definitely quite a few weeks, and basically what happened is Linda went up to Premier Clark and she introduced herself, and Clark replied with, "Nice to meet you, Linda." And then Linda came back and said, "I'll never vote for you." And Clark said, "You don't have to. That's why we live in a democracy." And then she ended up walking away to meet other people who were waiting to talk to her. And then Clark walked away, and then Linda replied with, "Thank goodness, hopefully you won't get elected in." And then she turned right to the news camera, who was standing right next to her. So it was almost like it was like a manufactured outrage, and that's where the headline came from for that. And a lot of people really blamed Christy Clark for this as well, and a lot of the social media conversation was talking about how she was either arrogant or aloof or uncaring about her constituents, when really she was actually just going on to
Yeah.
talk to other people
Yeah.
that were also there to meet her, right?
This was a classic case of the media running with the story, and this could have also fell into the fake news category as well, I think, because what would have needed to happen here is that Christy Clark would have needed to, rather than attack the NDP in this case, attack the media for making such an erroneous statement on this. And we need to recall that the election of the BC Liberals was close. It was, within a few tenths of a percentage point that they came in together on the popular vote. And the Liberals actually won 43 seats. And one of the ridings where this actually happened could have flipped and potentially, been a decider in the election, along with a couple others that were really close. So you kind of have to look at the story and wonder and see how much of a huge impact that this actually had on the process that you guys then embarked on in BC. So,
indeed, and I think that leads us nicely into my BC story of the year, and that is basically the ongoing stories that came out regarding the election that we had here in May. And it all started out with in episode 7, where it was called "The Best Government That Money Can Buy," and it was talking about how the donor system to political parties in BC was basically unregulated, and it led to places like the New York Times, of all places, to call us the Wild West. And that got not just national but international coverage on how terrible our system was when it came to donor system, and how the Liberals weren't changing it at all, and how the NDP promised to change it, but they were taking advantage of the system as well. And that was something that really defined the election, was not just I and Linda, but also the donor system. And that really shaped what was to come. And after the election period, when no party formed a majority, on episode 22, we talked about how the throne speech was laid out by Christy Clark, and it was an attempt to kind of court the Green Party and the NDP to help keep the Liberals in power. And what the headline was there is that Clark's left turn worries her party's Conservatives could endanger Liberals' free enterprise coalition. So basically, they had their throne speech a couple months before the election. It was a typical BC Liberal platform, and then right after the election, they basically flipped and put a bunch of NDP policies into it as well, just to try and court the Green vote, and it basically failed miserably, and the Greens ended up going with the NDP anyways. And basically, that change of government was the BC story of the year, and that's something that we're continuing to watch, of course.
And that all could have been mitigated relatively easily from both these two story points that we just talked about here. So,
exactly.
Our next category is firing line story of the year, and of course that's where we highlight just what the media, completely gets wrong, or where the coverage just is not up to par with this. And for me, this goes back to episode 20, when a woman in Toronto was charged with assault at a Scarborough mall, in particular a Canadian Tire store. She started hitting someone in the store with a golf club, I believe. And it wasn't until after that she actually got to court in that case that we learned that she had declared herself a supporter of ISIS. And when this happened, there were some inklings beforehand that this might have been the case, but the media didn't exactly talk about it at the time that this was actually what was going on in this story. But I think there was a case of finding ISIS paraphernalia or somewhere along the lines of that, but it wasn't mentioned at all in the initial story when this was reported. And I mean, you look at the headline, "Assault at Scarborough Mall." You might assume that someone might have just got in a scuffle over, a lawnmower store or something, for example. Little do you know that it was something that was actually motivated by radical Islamic terrorist beliefs. So, huge miss there by the media.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of huge misses, my firing line story of the year was in episode 24, when the government formally apologized to Omar Khadr, and they paid out, I believe it was
10.5 million, I think.
10.5 billion, and Khadr had initially sued the government for $20 million. And the reason why they paid him out, according to Prime Minister Trudeau, is because they thought they would lose the case and have to end up paying more. And so they basically cut it in half and settled with him instead. But in settling with him, they basically said that they would basically give the money away to someone who was, anywhere between a child soldier to basically a terrorist. And the Cotter story is really controversial, and to really find out more about it, we would have to go back to episode 24. But I think that was something that the media covered quite a bit, but I'm not really sure if they covered it completely fairly, because they didn't really talk about Cotter very much himself. And that was something that was missed a lot in the media, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And, as much as the government might like to try, it's very hard to hide $10.5 million going to a convicted terrorist on a Friday afternoon. That will be seen regardless of whenever you publish it out. I think it was even near Canada Day, if I recall, though that might need to be checked. And, another huge thing they missed about this is they mentioned nothing at all about the widow of the U.S. soldier, Christopher Speer, that they killed. Nothing at all was really mentioned in the mainstream media regarding this. So that was another huge miss this year. So.
That's right.
All right. We also have a huge list of stories that we contemplated uncovering this year, but we ultimately didn't cover. And these are stories that would have made the show, but at the same time, there are just so many better things that we could have put in place. And this one, for me, goes all the way back to the beginning, from when we were first building the right side. And the story is that Marian Monsef escapes the liberal adventure in electoral reform. So, of course, you guys might recall that there was a cabinet shuffle this past January where Marian Monsef was moved out of the ministry regarding democratic reform and became the new Minister of Status of Women. And this is, of course, because of the file on electoral reform. Now, this would have been a huge thing for us to cover here, because recall that during the 2015 election, if you were around for that time, electoral reform was one of the central planks of the Liberal Party's platform, and was one of the many things that younger people did vote for the party on. And that, with this cabinet shuffle, just got completely swept under the rug and moved away when you think about it, even though it was something that the government tried to do, but they took a lot of heat for not doing it properly. And as a result, no one could come to agreement on it, so the entire plan was just shelved.
That's right, and it wasn't just some random promise that was made in the Liberal platform. Like, Trudeau verbatim said that 2015 would be the last election under first past the post, and he said that he was going to implement electoral reform. Now, as soon as he got elected, he decided maybe that's not such a good thing, and decided that he would end up doing it anyway. So he basically blatantly broke the promise there. And that was something that we didn't really get to talk about, as you said before, because we were just starting up the right side, and it basically happened just before we started up.
Indeed. So where does that take you for what would you have liked to talk about that if you had the chance to?
So there was a story that I put in for consideration way back on episode 8, and this was where there was a conservative senator, I believe it was, and he was, the headline read that he had sex with the teen and begs forgiveness for moral failing, but said that he's not ready to resign. And this was Senator Don Meredith, and he was basically asking for forgiveness even though he was breaking the law, basically. And though he was appointed to be a senator, he didn't decide to resign on this. And this was something that I wanted to talk about at the time, but there was just so many other stories to cover at the time. And this was something that not only did the media really not talk about very much, I don't think we've heard about this ever again after this. I mean, it's 9 months later now, but you know, have
Just
we heard
compare this
about
with
him
Mike
at all?
Duffy, for example, or Patrick Brazeau.
Exactly, and Brazeau we still know about because he's always in the media, it seems, about something or other. Whereas this, it was basically swept under the rug. So uh, that's something that didn't really get covered very much, and I wish we had been able to cover it as well, and to be able to follow up on it.
That's very true. All right. So our next section is fake news story of the year, and it took us until episode 47 to finally define our definition of fake news in our word of the week section. And that was, of course, the episode in which we had the topic regarding Jason Kenney undermining his message in over-the-top attacks from the Edmonton Journal, from Graham Thompson, where basically what we saw in this Edmonton Journal article and previous articles from the Edmonton Journal is that the headline would say one thing, they would make an assertion in the first paragraph, but then by the second or third paragraph, they would quote something, say, for example, a tweet or an actual bill that was in the legislature at the time. And those tweets or those bills would outright verbatim prove what the Edmonton Journal was trying not to prove. But there is always some way of the Edmonton Journal, in this case, trying to wiggle their way around this. And that's what led us to define fake news on episode 47 of The Right Side. And that's why this is in this category. And, you know, this is something that we have constantly been looking out for this year. And, you know, sometimes we cover it, sometimes we don't. But this was a pretty big one because the numbers were there. And anyone who could do math in either of these cases would have seen that, yes, what these people are saying is true. Maybe there might have been something different in the exact language that would be used, but at the end of the day, it just appeared to be a little bit of a nitpick from the journalists that caused them to make the point that they were actually making in this case. So that's my fake news story of the year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I completely agree with you there. Like, it was just crazy how they said that he was undermining his message when it was clear that the public opinion was with him. And he eventually ended up winning with over 70% of the vote in that riding. And then a lot of people were saying, well, it was obviously a safe conservative riding anyways. But a lot of people were missing the point on this, and that people were really trying to publicly attack Jason Kenney through the media, and he seems to have carried through without having any problems about it. So we'll have to see how this goes on as well.
All right.
Now my fake news story of the year was something a little bit different as well. This was a story that you covered back on episode 11, and it was called "Is It Time for a Conservative Party Split?" So this was an article in Global News, and it was about what they described as a social entrepreneur and columnist, Scott Gilmore, and how he described that he was a self-loathing Tory, and he basically said, I hate my party. It's time to build a new one that genuinely believes in liberty, equality, and facts over ideology. And he basically said that he wanted the Conservative Party to split apart. And what was missed in this article is that he is actually, not only is he a entrepreneur and a writer, and making charities, but he's also married to Catherine McKenna, who you might remember is the Liberal Minister of Environment and Climate Change, and she's been in the media quite a bit as well. So here we have basically a Liberal who's advocating for the Conservative Party to break down, and that was something that was missed in the media, and
the media carried the story as if, you know, okay, they're married, but he's allowed to have his own opinion. But we're not going to exactly say outright who he's related to and what his relationship to her is.
Exactly, and that was something that, you know, that is something that we defined as being fake news, as leading with something that's very different from what the story actually is. And the story there is that He is married to a Liberal cabinet minister, and yet he's calling himself a conservative and wanting to have the Conservative Party split apart. And that's really something that was very interesting, especially because he predicted that Michael Chong was the only candidate capable of beating Justin Trudeau in 2019 because his values are the most reflective of Canada. And I think, as we could see in the Conservative race, is that a lot of people didn't agree with him there and did not vote for Michael Chong.
That's right. I think he
As,
came in around position 11 or something, I recall. Out of
it
14,
wasn't
something
quite
like that.
wasn't quite that low, but it was definitely in the lower half, and it was something that a lot of people expected would happen. So that's why I call this one the fake news story of the year, and where a Liberal tried to split up the Conservative Party.
All
And I
right.
thought that I think from any political spectrum, that's just interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely very interesting. And if you think these stories are funny, just wait until you reach our next story, which is our funniest stories. And, you know, back in the summer, episode 28, the episode title was The Perils of Kayaking. Now, this story should not have been a story. It was just downright hilarious, the images that came from this. But Justin Trudeau fell out of a kayak, and the media talked about it for the better part of a week.
Indeed, yeah, he visited my lovely town of Victoria and went kayaking out in the ocean, and he fell out of a kayak, and the media was there to capture it, and all the photographers were there to capture him from many different camera angles, and they decided to talk about that for a week, and that was definitely pretty funny. that was what they decided to cover.
And just to highlight the absolute absurdity and the hilarious nature of this, that exact week there was an ongoing discussion going on between Jason Kenney and the BC government regarding potential repercussions against BC if the Trans Mountain Pipeline did not proceed ahead. So there was indeed actual news going on in BC pertaining to the energy industry down there in the Lower Mainland. But this gobbled up most of the coverage and was on the front page of, I think, all the major papers there, wasn't it?
Yeah, what you could definitely say that it really did make a splash in the newspapers. It was just strange to see how it just dominated the news cycle for the better part of a week, and that's all they would talk about was how he visited, and he kissed a new bride, that he kind of gate crashed a wedding, and went up, kayaked up to her, and got a kiss on the cheek, and then he went out, and when he first got in, he fell out of the kayak, and that's basically what they talked about. Very, very funny, wasn't it?
You know, I didn't know where we were going to go with the right side when we began. I didn't think we would go that far.
Yeah, I mean, when we're talking about news, apparently that was news, and that's why I think that we both found that really funny. But I also found another a story that I found was really funny as well, and that was back on episode 24. It was right in the middle of summer as well, and Trudeau had a really tough time at this time because he went up on the stage in Ottawa to celebrate Canada's 150th birthday, and of course there were lots of celebrations going on about this as well. And then he made a speech about it, wanting to include all Canadians together, no matter what part of the country they were from. And he said, "We may live in British Columbia, Yukon, the Northwest Territories, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Nunavut, Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, or Newfoundland and Labrador. But we embrace that diversity while knowing in our hearts that we're all Canadians." And it's very interesting how he decided to forget Alberta in that list.
And he didn't
And
even come back on stage to correct that. It was actress Sandra Oh, I believe, that corrected him when she came on stage.
Exactly. And then it was really funny how after that they went over to now retired anchor Peter Mansbridge and the CBC staff, and they did an interview and lots of handshakes and hugs and smiles. And basically, Mansbridge and Rosemary Barton tried to basically cover it up and say that it was an honest mistake, and that he. They were wondering if he had turned it around enough to make sure that the public opinion was still with him. And it was really interesting to see how our news organization that is supposed to be, covering the news on behalf of all Canadians, to try and make sure that, that Trudeau's public opinion is still strong, and whether he, just to cover it up and make sure, oh, no, it's okay, right? That sort of thing. So that was what I thought was pretty funny. Not only that it was Alberta that I forgot, for one thing, but that the CBC tried to cover that up. And I thought that was really, really quite hilarious at the time.
And what makes it more hilarious and perhaps even sad about this is that this made international media. It was being talked about in the United States. So there we go.
Indeed.
All right. So if that wasn't absurd, these next stories are going to be really absurd. And as you can tell, we're kind of escalating here, and we've been escalating towards the most absurd story this year on the right side. And that's where we are at right now. Okay. You ready for this?
I am always ready.
Episode 37. Canada forgets to mention Jewish people at Holocaust Memorial. So this was when the new Holocaust Memorial and Museum was unveiled in Ottawa, and there were stories in the CBC Global about the museum. There was even pictures of the monument there. But there was no reference at all in those pictures, in that memorial, to the Jewish people that died during the Holocaust. And what is truly absurd about this is that the media here in Canada didn't cover it. We had to go to the BBC of all places to find coverage of this. To find coverage of news made in Ottawa on episode 37. Now, when you think about it, the Holocaust was a really tragic event, perhaps the most tragic event of the 20th century. Granted, there were lots of them, but for Canada, a country that harbored many Jewish people to safety during the Second World War, to forget something like this, that's a pretty big deal. And this was mentioned very, very few places in the Canadian media, though it was reported on very well by the BBC, which, you take that for what it's worth. We had to go to the BBC to get accurate news on Canada. It's pretty absurd and downright appalling.
Indeed, it was. And that they thought they could have a Holocaust monument and, to commemorate what all the tragic victims of the Holocaust, and yet not mention the word Jew or Jewish, and to not talk about the Jewish people at all in this. It was really quite something to see. And the fact that they did that, it was really quite something.
Yeah. The initial monument said that here's what it said. The National Holocaust Monument commemorates the millions of men, women, and children murdered during the Holocaust and honors those survivors who persevered and were able to make their way to Canada after one of the darkest chapters in history. The monument recognizes the contributions these survivors have made to Canada and serves as a reminder that we must be vigilant in standing guard against hate, intolerance, and discrimination. Inaugurated by the Right Honourable Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, on September 27th, 2017.
Yeah, that's pretty vague when it's talking about just the millions of men, women, and children. I think a lot of family members and descendants of these people would like to see all of the types of people that were persecuted, and to be able to honor them, I think a lot better. And that was just something, how the government just decided to forget about the different types of people.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, they are going to be changing the plaque, so credit to them on that. But the people with the real egg on their face in this case is the mainstream media, as that we had to go to the BBC for this story. I don't know if you can get more absurd than that, but what do you got?
So back on episode 35, I was talking about a filmmaker who is making a comedy web series, and it turned out that the whole thing was a big publicity stunt. And what he did was he was charging tickets, and he created what he called justice pricing, and he was going to charge to what he referred to as cisgender white males $20, while everyone else was being charged $10, because he wanted to be able to base it on the purchasing power of individual groups and price discrimination. So that was a pretty interesting story how I covered, and it got national media coverage, and everyone was talking about it. And it was just from a little, my own little town here, and it was really interesting how a lot of articles came out about this, and there was a lot of fake outrage being made about this. And then once everyone found out that it was actually a hoax, they actually went after the guy himself, and it was just so absurd to see just this whole thing blow up.
It's like the media chasing their own tail here.
Yeah, exactly, and they were just going after. They were trying to chase the story and what was going to drive the most clicks and revenue, and it was so clearly a publicity stunt. And even when it came out and I saw it and I didn't know that it was a publicity stunt, I even thought to myself, there's something here that seems a little bit fishy. And I think if they had done their due diligence and kind of dug a little bit more into the story, they would have uncovered that. But they rushed to get the stories out, and here we are. It was just a really strange period of time in our right side history, where we covered the story even though we knew it was a publicity stunt, and it turns out that's what it was. And that's why I called that the most absurd story of the year.
That's definitely a major head scratcher there, and I mean, I'm not sure which is worse. Honestly, they're both really bad, but I'm not sure which is worse at this point. So anyways, that's what we got for stories. We're going to talk a little bit now about some of our own opinions and what we liked about doing this year. We won't be long if you guys are getting restless. I know we're approaching the end of our normal time here. But favorite right side episodes. So we have effectively done 49 episodes right now. So we're going to talk a little bit about our favorite episodes here. And my favorite episode is episode 1. And that's for a number of reasons. Number one, it saw the end of the electoral reform issue, and that there was a poll that actually came out after that cabinet shuffle that said most Canadians actually like the current voting system. Number 2 was a story with the headline, Justin Trudeau, the Boy Scout, must settle into Donald Trump's world, which, as we've seen with NAFTA. Number 3, Wild Rose leader Brian Jean prepared to step down and run for a merged Alberta Conservative Party. And those were stories that really set the tone for the entire year, I feel. And, as a way, also kind of paved the way for us as for things that we would all be talking about. Because, of course, we talked about all of those things at length on numerous other episodes going forward. And there was also on that episode the forecast of the federal deficit to hit $12.7 billion in 16-17. So lots of forecasting there.
And I think another reason why the first episode was probably one of your favorites as well as mine was we were just starting out back then. We didn't really have all of the format of the show or what we were doing, and we were just trying to figure things out. And I think that first episode really showed that we could do this, and that almost a year later, we've now come to the conclusion that I think the right side kind of fills a good gap in what's known in the podcasting world for Canadian news media, because there's a lot that's not being talked about, and a lot that's being talked about probably a bit too much. And I think now that we can say 49 episodes
49
later,
years.
Almost right. So sometimes it feels like it. But 49 episodes later, that I think that we've really done a good thing, and I hope that you listeners think so as well.
So what was your favorite episode? I think I have an idea, but what do you think?
So my favorite episode was indeed episode 28, and this would have been in the middle of the summer, when we had that Trudeau kayaking episode, and that's what we called the perils of kayaking. And that was when I talked about how Trudeau was covered in the local BC media, and all of the all of the perils he had when it came to you know getting into a kayak, and how he discovered just how cold the Pacific Ocean can be. But not just that, it was also the episode in which we talked about how resistance is not futile when it comes to freedom of expression. So this was a story that came out of Manitoba, where there was a license plate that read uh, "assimilate," and that was in reference to the Star Trek Borg, who basically say we are the Borg and resistance is futile. And Shane, of course, knows a bit more about Star Trek than I do, but I think it was really something that it kind of blew up a little bit because it was talking about. How he got censured and how they confiscated his plate, saying that it was considered offensive towards First Nations who don't like being referred to as being assimilated, and that was something that I really liked covering at the time, just because it was such an absurd story to begin with as well, and just those two together, I thought were really fun episodes to or fun topics to cover. And but also in that episode, that was also the episode where we talked about how Jason Kenney uh, was talking about BC over the Trans Mountain Pipeline and how he was not going to respond passively. And we're also talking about the Montreal's Olympic Stadium being used as a shelter for asylum seekers. So there was a lot going on in that episode, and I think we both had quite a bit of fun doing that one as well.
That's right. And that takes us into Newsmaker of the Year. So, who was the cause of most of our news? Now, I'm going to pick someone, and you might not think that this has a direct bearing on us, and this might not be an actual newsmaker in the sense of Canada, but it actually is. And I have to say, the newsmaker of the year for Canadian news is actually Donald Trump, the U.S. president. Because if you look at the government's foreign policy, everything that this government has done this year on foreign policy has been in response to Donald Trump. And it hasn't exactly all gone well. From the issues on NAFTA, from the issues on softwood lumber and supply management, Boeing versus Bombardier, the Chinese deal with free trade was a response to Donald Trump and a way to try and get a better negotiating stance with him. The pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership talks at the end and holding up the ratification of that. All of these things, all of these major issues pertaining to Canada's economy comes back to our foreign policy and this government responding to President Donald Trump. And that's another point to make, is that when we started this episode, he had only been president for a week, and we didn't know exactly what the relationship at that time would be between Justin Trudeau and Donald Trump. They do say it's a good relationship that they have, but as you can see from the foreign policy front, it doesn't exactly always go our way. And that has made many stories here, from trade to borders and immigration between us, and even the refugees coming across the border from the U.S. All that stuff comes back to the U.S. president.
Right, and I think my newsmaker of the year is kind of related to yours, in the sense that mine is Justin Trudeau, and he has been in the news so much this year, and he's given us so much to talk about on the right side. That's the reason why, for better or for worse, he is my newsmaker of the year, just because he has been out there. He's been doing lots of interesting and different things, shall we say, whether it's from tax increases or falling out of a kayak show. Well, we go back to, or when it comes to the immigration policy, it comes to uh, all the cabinet ministers and how they have their faux pas, or all of the asylum seekers that were coming across the border. There were a lot of things to talk about this year when it related to Justin Trudeau, and I think he created a lot of the news that was out there, and I think that is why he is my newsmaker of the year.
You're right. These two are definitely complements to each other. One responding and one causing the action. So I think that's a good choice then on both of our parts. All right, and as you'll know, we normally end the episode with the word of the week, except this time we're going to do word of the year. And this is where we're going to talk about a word that we talked about and defined in one of our previous episodes and re-highlighted for its own importance. My word of the year is going to be speaker from episode 20. And as a reminder of this, the speaker has the role is to guide Parliament through its agenda and recognizing members of the House to speak if they wish to debate or question a decision in the House. It is a vastly important role in the Westminster system of political governments, and without one, a government cannot function. Traditionally, the Speaker, after elected, feigns reluctance and is dragged to the Speaker's chair by the Prime Minister and opposition leader, dating back to a time in Britain where the Speaker had to relay news to the monarch and would often lose his head if the news wasn't good. And the reason for picking this is because we talked about on this episode, in particular, the situation with the hung parliament and the situation regarding the Speaker of the House in BC, but also we had a quick look at what was going on in the UK election at that exact time, which also resulted in a hung parliament. So Speaker was very important on that episode, and it's something that a lot of Canadians, I think, weren't truly aware of the importance of that role and how far it goes back. So my word of the week is speaker.
Exactly, and not just the importance of the role, but the amount of influence that you can garner from being a speaker, because not only do you have to be more impartial in your views in the parliament or in the legislature, but you also get to network with a lot of people from the different parties. And I think that was something that helped Andrew Scheer become the new Conservative leader, because he was the former speaker under the Harper government, of course. And that was something that allowed him to network a lot and kind of gain his base in the Conservative Party. And I think that was one of the things that helped him win. And that was something that I think we wanted to highlight as the speaker as being a very important role in our government, though a lot of people don't know that much about it.
That's right. And there was a whole debacle as well with that with the Liberal Party in BC as well. So lots of stuff developed from the word of the speaker.
Mm-hmm.
What do you got for word of the year?
So my word of the year was justice, and justice was something that was talked about a lot back on episode 29. And episode 29 was our NDP leadership race special, where we profiled the 4 NDP leadership candidates and all the policies that could majorly impact the Canadian economy and all the other things that were going on with that. And so we were talking about Charlie Angus and Guy Caron and Nikki Ashton, and then the eventual winner, Jagmeet Singh. And a central theme that came about from that episode was the word justice. Now, justice, of course, was being defined as, just behavior or treatment, the quality of being fair or reasonable, or the administration of law or authority in maintaining those two things. And I think that was something that the NDP kind of repurposed for their own platforms, is basically adding justice on the back of everything, whether it was social justice or equality justice or racial justice or economic justice
Climate
or
justice.
any other thing. Climate justice, a lot of other different things like that. And that was something that they repurposed to their own means. And that was something that we saw a lot of during that NDP race as well, and something that is their whole central platform, it seems, in how they're getting justice to all these people that they view as not having justice in the first place. And that was something that we saw quite a bit, and that was why that word is my word of the year.
And I mean that makes sense, because that was in all of their all of their platforms, and we need to look at these platforms, because if one of these candidates, well, now we know it's Jagmeet Singh, but if Jagmeet Singh or any of these other candidates instead were to win the NDP leadership race, they would have been inheriting third-party status. And we know in the past that it's entirely possible for a third party to go to government status. It happened in Canada, and it happened in Alberta here. So it's entirely possible, and that's precisely why we did that special. And I think why the word of the week on episode 29 being justice was so important back then. So,
indeed.
All right, well, that wraps us up for this year on the right side. I don't believe there's anything else for this week or this year.
I think either the week or the year, I think we've covered it all fairly well in 2017. So all that's left to be said now is that we hope to be here at the end of 2018 as well to give you another wonderful year at the right side, and to be able to always share the right side of the news, to get down, dig to the truth, and to cut through all the bias and sensationalism.
And if you want full show notes and follow along with our episodes, you can find that at rightsidenews.ca. We're also on iTunes and YouTube at rightsidenews.ca/iTunes or /YouTube. And we're on social media on Twitter and Facebook at RightSideCA. And with that being said, we'll see you next week for another episode of The Right Side.
We will see you next time, and we hope you enjoyed this show.